On the 21st of August, 1986, in the hills of northwestern Cameroon, the people who lived around a lake called Nyos did not wake up. More than 1,700 of them, 1,746 men, women, and children, were found dead where they had fallen, in their homes, in their doorways, along the paths between the houses. And it was not only the people. Around 3,500 head of cattle lay dead in the fields with them. Goats, dogs, birds, insects, whole villages silenced in a single night, with no fire, no flood, no attacker, no wound. The living who remained woke into a world where almost everything that breathed had simply stopped. The survivors, when they could speak, told a strange and consistent story. In the night, they said, a cloud had come, a cloud that came down off the lake and rolled through the valley, and where it passed, people fell unconscious, and many of them never woke again. Some who lived remembered a smell, like rotten eggs, some said, or like gunpowder, and then nothing. They dropped where they stood and came to hours later, if they came to at all, surrounded by the dead. What killed them was not obvious, and that is what makes this story what it is. There was no explosion anyone had heard in the ordinary sense. No building was damaged. No structure burned or collapsed. The houses stood exactly as they had the day before, untouched, and inside and around them lay the dead. Whatever had come through had killed the living and left everything they had built completely intact. That detail alone made people reach, immediately, for explanations that went far beyond nature. Tonight, we are going to go down to that lake. We are going to follow the investigators who arrived into the silence. Look at the clues they found, the reddened water, the smell, the frogs that lived when everything else died, and work our way toward the answer they finally reached. And then, we are going to sit with the part they could never quite close, and with the question the people of that valley have asked from the very first morning. Was this really only the lake? Or was it something else? Let us start with the silence, because everyone who came to Nyos in those first weeks describes the same thing, and it is the detail that stays with you. When the government of Cameroon understood the scale of what had happened, it asked for help, and scientists and doctors began to arrive from other countries. Among them was a British physician who came to the region to help make sense of the disaster. And what struck him first, before the science, before anything, was how quiet it was. Not the ordinary quiet of a rural place, a total quiet, because it was not only the people and the cattle that had died. The insects were gone, the birds were gone. The living hum that fills any landscape with animals in it had been switched off. He had come expecting a medical emergency and found instead a kind of stillness that should not exist anywhere life has ever been. And in that stillness, one thing was still alive, and it is the kind of detail that no one would invent, because it is too strange to invent. Frogs. Around the lake, in a place where nearly every other living creature had died, the frogs were still there. It turned out there was a reason. Frogs have a particularly hardy physiology, able to endure conditions that would kill a mammal outright. But standing in that silence, the sight of the living frogs among all that death must have felt like a message no one could read. Another scientist who came was a professor from an American university, a researcher who, by a strange piece of luck, had actually visited Lake Nyos before the disaster. He knew what the lake was supposed to look like, and when he returned in the weeks after, the lake was wrong. The water he remembered had been blue and clear. The water he found was a murky reddish-brown, the color of rust, the color of old blood. Something had come up from the bottom of that lake and changed it from the inside out. He noticed something else, too, and it was the clue that began to close the door on the wilder theories. None of the buildings were affected. Nothing was knocked down, nothing swept away, nothing scorched. That single observation quietly ruled out a whole list of suspects. It was not a flood. A flood would have moved things, wrecked things, left mud and destruction. It was not a hurricane or a windstorm for the same reason, and it was not an eruption of the old volcano the lake sits within, because an eruption leaves ash and fire and shattered ground, and there was none of that. Whatever killed the people and the animals had been gentle with the houses. It had killed selectively everything that breathed and nothing that did not. So what does that? What rolls down a valley in the night, kills every breathing thing in its path, and leaves the walls standing? The answer came, in part, from a survivor, and this is where the human detail cracks the case open. One of the people who lived through the cloud told the investigators what it had been like. He remembered the smell, that rotten egg gunpowder smell the others described. He remembered running for his house, and he remembered drinking milk and then vomiting something dark, something he could not name and could not describe. That account, and others like it, gave the researchers a suspect at last, because that specific combination, the smell described as rotten eggs or gunpowder, the sudden collapse, the loss of consciousness, matched something known. Fighter pilots exposed to very high concentrations of carbon dioxide had reported the very same thing, a smell like rotten eggs or gunpowder, right before it overwhelmed them. Carbon dioxide, the gas we exhale with every breath, harmless in small amounts, invisible, odorless in ordinary concentration, and in enough quantity, in a low place where it can pool and displace the air, absolutely lethal. It does not burn. It does not break buildings. It simply replaces the air, and everything that needs to breathe suffocates, quietly, often before it even understands what is happening. And here is where the lake itself becomes the villain of the story, in a way that is genuinely, scientifically true, and stranger than most inventions. Lake Nyos sits in the crater of a volcano that is not active in the way we usually mean. It does not erupt with lava and fire. But beneath it, deep down, the earth still breathes out gas. Over many years, carbon dioxide from that volcanic activity had been seeping up from below and dissolving into the deep water at the bottom of the lake. And because the lake is deep and still, and because the cold, heavy, gas-saturated water at the bottom did not mix with the lighter water above, that carbon dioxide simply stayed down there, accumulating year after year, dissolved into the depths under the pressure of all the water above it, held down, held in, like the gas in a bottle that has not yet been opened. The lake was, in effect, a vast natural container slowly filling with a poison it could not release, until something released it. The leading explanation is that some trigger, most likely a landslide, a mass of earth sliding down into the deep water from the side of the crater, disturbed that bottom layer. And once the deep, gas-heavy water was pushed upward even a little, the process ran away with itself. As that water rose, the pressure on it dropped, and the dissolved carbon dioxide began to come out of solution, the way a bottle of soda, once opened and shaken, erupts into foam. Except this was an entire lake. In a matter of moments, an enormous volume of carbon dioxide tore up out of the water and burst into the air above the lake. And that same violent overturning is almost certainly what stirred up the iron-rich water from the bottom and turned the whole lake that rusty, reddish-brown the professor found, the color of the disaster written across the surface. The gas that came out of that lake was heavier than air, so it did not rise and disperse into the sky. It sank. It flowed down and out of the crater, following the shape of the land, pouring down into the valleys where the villages were, a silent, invisible tide of suffocation moving through the dark. It filled the low ground. It pushed the breathable air out ahead of it, and the people and the animals, sleeping in its path, breathed it in without waking, and most of them never woke at all. That is why the survivors who lived tended to be the ones who fell. It sounds backward, but it fits. When a person loses consciousness and drops to the floor, Well, in a normal disaster, that would be the end of them. But there is a grim logic to it here, one the investigators worked out. When you collapse and your breathing slows, and when you are down low, close to the ground, sometimes below the thickest part of the descending gas as it settled and thinned, you might, by pure chance, take in just a little less than the person still standing. Falling early could mean breathing less, and breathing less that night could mean the difference between waking up and not. So that is the answer. A rare and terrible natural event, understood well enough now that it even has a name. A Limnic eruption, the overturning of a gas-charged lake. And it is real. This is not folklore. The carbon dioxide was measured, the mechanism was studied, and the science was taken seriously enough that in the years after, engineers installed pipes in Lake Nyos to slowly vent the gas from the bottom in a controlled way, to fountain it out gradually so that it can never again build up to the point of catastrophe. The lake is, in a sense, being diffused, a little at a time, so that it never fills up and goes off again. That should be the end of it. A closed case. The gas, the landslide, the invisible flood, the science that explained it, and the engineering that tamed it. And for the scientific world, it largely is. But I want to be honest with you about the part that never fully closed, because it is the part that keeps this story alive in the valley to this day. The carbon dioxide explanation, as strong as it is, was never proven with absolute total certainty. It is the most likely answer, overwhelmingly the most likely. But the disaster happened in the dark, in a remote place, with no instrument recording the moment it began. The reconstruction is built backward, from the bodies, from the water, from the survivors' accounts, from what we know the lake was holding. It fits. It fits almost perfectly. But almost is a word that leaves a door open, and human beings faced with a horror this large and this strange will always look through an open door. And so for many of the people who actually lived around Lake Nyos, who lost their families and their neighbors and their entire world in a single night, the official answer never fully satisfied. To them, the idea that the lake itself simply breathed out death felt too quiet, too impersonal for something so enormous. There were other explanations whispered in the aftermath. Some believed it had not been the lake at all, but a weapon, that some foreign power had tested some kind of gas or bomb on Cameroonian soil, and that the invisible cloud that killed their families had been made by human hands and covered up as a natural disaster. There has never been any evidence for that. No trace of a weapon was ever found, no proof of a test, nothing to support the idea beyond the sheer unbelievability of the truth. And the truth, a lake quietly filling with poison for years and then exhaling it all in a single night, is, when you sit with it, almost harder to accept than a conspiracy. Because a conspiracy at least has a villain, a person to blame, a reason. What the science offers instead is something with no intent at all, the patient, indifferent chemistry of a deep lake and a sleeping volcano, killing 1,700 people not out of malice, but simply because the conditions were finally right. That is the thing I keep coming back to with Nyos. There was no monster, there was no enemy, there was no warning, and there was no one to be angry at. The lake did not hate anyone. It just held its breath for years and years, and then, one night in August, it let it out. The pipes are working now. The gas fountains up out of the deep water in a controlled, steady plume, and the lake is safer than it was. People still live in that region. Life came back. The birds returned. The insects, the frogs were never gone. And the lake sits there in its crater, blue again on the surface, calm again, beautiful again, giving no sign at all of what it is still holding in its depths, or of the night it decided to breathe. We understand it now, mostly. We have measured it and named it, and built machines to keep it from happening again. But understanding a thing is not the same as being at peace with it. The people of that valley go on living beside a lake that once killed almost everyone they knew, in silence, in a single night, for reasons that had nothing to do with them at all. Some of them accept the science, some of them never will, and the lake keeps its own counsel, the way deep water always does. If this is the kind of story that stays with you after the screen goes dark, the kind you turn over on the walk to your car, the kind you find yourself thinking about at the edge of sleep, then subscribe, because there is more of it coming. More quiet places that turned deadly. More disasters with no villain in them. More questions the science answered, and then left you sitting with anyway. The lake does not care whether we understand it. It has waited before. It can wait again.